All right, so are you ready to put on your detective hats today?
Always game for good mystery.
Perfect. Because today we're diving deep into the world of research.
Oh, sounds intriguing. What kind of case are we cracking today?
We're going to be exploring how we gather knowledge about people, behaviors, all those trends that kind of shape our world.
So we're talking about the tools of the trade for understanding human behavior.
Exactly.
Like, where do we even begin with something like that? There's got to be tons of ways to go about it.
Well, we've got a whole stack of research methods to dig into, kind of like different tools in a detective's kit. We'll be looking at survey research, ex post facto research, and even field experiments.
Ooh, field experiments. Those always sound exciting, getting out there in the real world.
Definitely. But let's start with something a little more foundational.
Okay, back to basics.
Yeah, let's talk about survey research. It seems like everyone and their dog is doing surveys these days.
True. I feel like I can't go online without someone asking me to rate my experience with something.
Right. From those polls that pop up everywhere to satisfaction surveys after practically everything, it's like surveys are everywhere.
And there's a good reason for that. Survey research is a really powerful way to observe and gather information from, large groups of people. It's not about manipulating anything, just capturing what people think, feel, and do in a snapshot.
So no mad scientist stuff, just pure observation. But how does someone actually go about conducting a survey? It can't just be about asking random people random questions, right?
You're right. It's definitely more systematic than that. Think of it like a detective building a case, step by step.
Okay, I like where this is going. Lay it on me. What's step one?
First, you got to define your objective. Like, what's the mystery you're trying to solve? What's the big question driving the whole investigation?
So it's about figuring out the what before you worry about the who.
Exactly. Then you got to figure out who your suspects are, the population you want to study.
So then it's on to the who. Okay, I'm following so far.
Perfect. Next comes designing your interrogation, or in this case, your survey questions.
Okay, now we're talking. What makes a good survey question? One that really gets to the heart of the matter.
Well, you have to decide on the format. Will it be multiple choice, structured interviews, maybe a bit of both? It really depends on what you're trying to find out.
So like choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And before you unleash those questions on the world, got to make sure they're sharp and to the point.
Yeah, you don't want to end up with a bunch of useless data because you phrased a question poorly.
Exactly. That's like a detective with a faulty magnifying glass.
Totally useless.
So before you launch the full investigation, you run a pilot test, like a dress rehearsal. Make sure those questions are clear, unbiased, and, actually gathering the evidence you need.
Makes total sense. Now, what about choosing the right people to answer those questions? I imagine that's pretty important too, right?
You bet. It's all about selecting a sample that actually reflects the key characteristics of the larger group. Think of it like, baking a cake. You need the right proportions of ingredients to make it delicious.
Okay, I'm with you. So too much flour, not enough sugar, and you've got a cake disaster.
Exactly. Same goes for survey research. If your sample is skewed, your results will be too. That's why researchers use techniques like randomization, like drawing names out of a hat. Gives everyone an equal chance of being selected.
So it's like ensuring a fair trial. Everyone gets a shot at being a witness to the research. What other techniques do they use for getting a good sample?
There's also stratification. It's like dividing the population into different categories, think age groups, income levels, or even geographical regions, and then randomly selecting people from each category. Make sure you capture the diversity of the whole group.
So it's not just about asking the right questions, but asking the right people. That's kind of fascinating. The selection process itself becomes a tool for data collection.
Exactly. And once you've got those witnesses lined up, you can start the conduct the survey.
Right. Administer those questionnaires, conduct those interviews, and then what? Drown in a sea of data.
Well, yeah, you gather all that data, but then comes the fun part, analyzing it. That's where statistical analysis comes in, helping researchers make sense of all that information and see if their hypotheses hold water.
So that's when you get to put on your Sherlock Holmes hat and start piecing together the clues.
Exactly. And then, of course, comes the big reveal, sharing the findings with the world.
Right, because what good is all that detective work if you don't share what you've learned?
Exactly. The final step is preparing a report that summarizes everything you found, all the key takeaways, and then communicating those findings to whoever needs to know. Sometimes that's a specific audience, sometimes it's the whole world.
Wow, so it's a whole journey, A process with a lot of twists and turns. Who knew survey research could be so adventurous?
It definitely can be. It's a powerful tool for understanding our world, that's for sure. But it's not the only tool in our detective's kit.
Speaking of other tools, you mentioned something earlier about ex post facto research. That sounds really intriguing, like being a historical detective or something.
It totally is. Imagine trying to understand what led to a certain outcome, but the event has already happened. You can't go back in time and change things, but you can still investigate what might have caused it.
Ooh, I'm already hooked. Tell me more.
Let's say we're trying to figure out the factors that might lead to, oh, I don't know, let's say delinquent behavior in a child. The delinquency is the effect, and we, as researchers, are trying to piece together the possible causes.
So it's like solving a mystery that's already happened. You're working backward, trying to figure out the why behind the what.
Precisely. Was it a lack of discipline at school, a difficult family situation, peer pressure, the social environment they grew up in? Ex post facto research helps us dig into those questions.
That sounds fascinating, but also incredibly challenging. Like, how do you even begin to tease apart all those potential factors?
It's definitely a challenge, no doubt about it. The key is controlling for all those potential variables and trying to pinpoint the most probable cause, or, sometimes it's a combination of causes. It's a bit like sifting through layers of historical data, trying to uncover the truth.
Wow, it really does sound like historical detective work. You need to be super meticulous and organized to keep track of all those variables.
You got it. And you also have to be super careful not to jump to conclusions. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Right, that whole correlation versus causation thing. I remember learning about that in school.
Exactly. There's a name for that kind of faulty thinking, the post hoc fallacy. It's a trap we can all fall into, assuming that because two things are related, one must have caused the other.
Okay, so ex post facto research is all about digging deep, being meticulous, and avoiding those tempting leaps of logic. It's a good thing we have those detective hats on.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of detective work, are you ready to step out of the history books and into the real world?
Always up for an adventure. You mentioned something about field experiments earlier, and those always sound exciting. What makes them so different from, say, lab experiments?
Well, with field experiments, we take that rigor of experimental research, the controlled variables and all that, and we bring it out into the messy, complex world we live in.
Ooh, so it's like taking the investigation out of the lab and onto the streets. I'm all for a little real-world action.
Me too. Instead of a sterile, controlled environment, we're dealing with real-world settings, which, comes with its own set of challenges and rewards.
I bet. Can you give me an example of what a field experiment might look like?
Sure. Imagine you're studying the effectiveness of different teaching methods, say traditional lectures versus more hands-on tutorials in a real school setting. You can't control everything that happens in a classroom, right? But you can still design an experiment to see how those methods impact learning.
Okay, walk me through that. How would you set up that experiment?
You could randomly assign students to two groups, one receiving those traditional lectures, the other participating in those tutorials. Then you'd measure their learning outcomes using tests or whatever assessments make sense. The trick is controlling as many extraneous variables as you can while accepting that the real world will always throw some curveballs.
So you're trying to strike a balance between that controlled environment of a lab and the unpredictability of real life. Sounds like a fun challenge.
It is. Field experiments are all about finding that sweet spot. And when they're done well, they provide some really valuable insights into how things actually work out in the real world that can have a huge impact on things like, policy and practical applications.
Right, because what works in theory doesn't always translate smoothly into real life.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned earlier that designing a field experiment is kind of like constructing a building. Can you break that down for me? I'm a visual learner, so analogies always help me wrap my head around things. Of course, just like with building a building, you need a solid plan, the right materials, and a clear process to create something that's both functional and sound, something that'll stand the test of time.
Okay, I'm liking this analogy already. So where do we start? What's the blueprint for a field experiment?
First, got to have a clear research question. What are you trying to investigate? Then you need to think about your setting and choose your sample carefully. Make sure those participants represent the population you're studying. Just like with surveys, using techniques like randomization and stratification can help you create a diverse and balanced sample.
So got to lay a strong foundation, both in terms of the research question and the people you're studying.
Exactly. Then you need the framework. The research design. That's the plan that determines how the experiment will be conducted, how you'll manipulate the independent variable, and how you'll measure the effects on the dependent variable.
So it's like the structural framework of a building holding everything together.
You got it. Then, of course, you need the right tools for the job.
Of course. No construction project is complete without the proper tools.
Exactly. You need to pick the right tools for data collection. These are the instruments you'll use to gather all that juicy information, standardized tests, surveys, observation checklists, even behavioral coding schemes, whatever works best for your research question.
Wow, so many options. It's like having a whole toolbox to choose from.
It is. Then comes the actual construction process, the procedure. This involves mapping out every single step of carrying out the experiment, from getting the necessary permissions and finding your participants to collecting baseline data, implementing the intervention, and measuring those outcomes.
Sounds like a lot of steps to keep track of.
It can be, but a well-designed procedure helps to ensure the integrity of your results. It's like having a detailed set of instructions so everyone knows exactly what to do and when to do it.
Makes sense. And then finally, you analyze all that data you've collected, right? See if your building can withstand scrutiny.
Exactly. You want to see if those findings support your hypotheses and if they have real-world implications. Field experiments can be a fantastic way to bridge the gap between research and practice, helping us understand how things work in the complex environments we live in.
This is all so fascinating. It really highlights how each research method offers a unique lens for understanding the world around us.
They absolutely do. But we've got one more intriguing tool to explore the case study method.
Ooh, case studies. Those always sound so in-depth and personal. Are they as exciting as they sound?
They definitely can be. Imagine you're a detective with just one really intriguing case to solve. That's the essence of the case study method.
Ooh, I love a good mystery. So instead of studying large groups, you're focusing all your attention on one specific person, event, or situation.
Exactly. Case studies go deep. They're all about uncovering those rich, detailed insights that you just wouldn't get from larger scale studies. Think of it like zooming in on a single brushstroke in a painting. You might miss the overall composition, but you get a much clearer understanding of the technique, the color choices, the artist's intention behind that single stroke.
So you're trading a wide-angle lens for a macro lens, getting up close and personal with your subject.
Exactly, and that's what makes case studies so powerful. You can uncover nuances and complexities that would otherwise be lost in the big picture.
That makes sense. But I'm curious, where do case studies fit into the overall research landscape? What fields use them most often?
You'll find case studies across a wide range of disciplines, but they're especially common in fields like clinical psychology, social work, education, and business. Think of a therapist working with a patient to understand their anxiety, or a teacher trying to figure out why a particular student is struggling. Those are classic case study scenarios.
Okay, so it's all about getting a deep understanding of that specific case. But can you really generalize from a single case to a larger population? Isn't that one of the criticisms of case study research?
You're right, that's a question that comes up a lot. While case studies aren't designed for making sweeping generalizations, that doesn't mean they can't contribute to scientific development.
So they're not meant to be the final word on a topic, but they can still offer valuable insights.
Exactly. They can help us generate hypotheses, explore new ideas, and even challenge existing assumptions. They can also provide valuable insights that inform practice and policy, even if they don't apply universally.
That makes sense. It's like each case study adds another piece to the puzzle, even if it doesn't complete the entire picture.
Perfect analogy. Now, there are different types of case studies, each with its own purpose. We've got illustrative case studies, exploratory case studies, cumulative case studies, and critical instance case studies. It's like having a whole toolkit of case study approaches.
Wow, so many different ways to approach a single case. That's pretty amazing.
It is. But just like any research method, there are some common misconceptions about case studies. Some folks think they're too anecdotal or subjective, or that they can't be used to test hypotheses. But those are myths. Case studies, when done rigorously, can be incredibly valuable tools for understanding complex issues.
So it's all about recognizing the strengths and limitations of each research method and choosing the right tool for the job.
You got it. And that's what makes the world of research so fascinating. There's always something new to learn, a new method to explore, a new mystery to unravel.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From surveys to field experiments and even those intriguing case studies, it's been quite a journey.
It has. And we've only just scratched the surface. But that's a good place to pause for now.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so you ready for a little trip back in time?
Always down for a history lesson, especially if it involves a good mystery.
Perfect, because today we're heading back to Salem, Massachusetts, 1692.
Ooh, Salem. The witch trials. That's a pretty intense case.
It is, and it's a great example of how we can use ex post facto research to try and understand those events, what led to that period of mass hysteria.
Yeah, it's a real-life historical thriller. What kind of clues do we have to work with?
Well, remember, with ex post facto research, the Salem witch trials, in this case, has already happened. We can't go back and change anything, so we have to be really careful about how we approach the evidence.
Right, no time travel for us, unfortunately. But we can still look at historical records.
Exactly. We'd be looking for anything that might have contributed to this mass hysteria, economic hardship, social tensions, maybe even something like ergot poisoning.
Wait, ergot poisoning? Like
Right.
from a fungus?
Yeah, it's a fungus that can grow on rye and other grains, and it can cause hallucinations. Some historians believe that ergot poisoning might have played a role in the Salem witch trials.
Wow, that's a pretty wild theory. So it wasn't just a simple case of superstition and fear running rampant.
It's rarely ever that simple, right? Especially when you're talking about a historical event with so many layers. Remember, one of the big challenges in ex post facto research is trying to control for all these potential variables to figure out the most likely cause.
Okay, so we've got economic hardship, social tensions, and now a hallucinogenic fungus in the mix. How do you even begin to sort through all that? It sounds like you'd need a whole team of experts.
You're not wrong, and that's often exactly what happens with ex post facto research. You might have historians, sociologists, psychologists, even scientists from other fields all working together to piece together the puzzle.
So it's like a giant collaborative detective effort with everyone bringing their expertise to the table.
Exactly, but even with a whole team of experts, it can still be tricky to separate correlation from causation. Just because those factors were present at the time doesn't automatically mean they caused the witch trials.
Right, that whole post hoc fallacy thing again. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Precisely. There could be a whole web of interconnected factors at play, so while that ergot poisoning theory is interesting, we can't just jump to conclusions.
So it's not about finding that one smoking gun, but more about understanding how all those factors might have interacted to create the conditions that led to the witch trials.
Exactly. It's a much more nuanced and complex process than just pointing fingers and saying, aha, this caused that.
That makes sense. It sounds like a lot of careful analysis, interpretation, and a healthy dose of skepticism. You have to be really careful not to oversimplify things or cherry evidence to support a particular theory.
Absolutely. And even with all that effort, sometimes we might never have a definitive answer. But that's okay. The goal of ex post facto research isn't always to find a neat and tidy solution. It's about deepening our understanding of a complex situation and uncovering those potential causal relationships.
So, even with all our detective work, some mysteries might remain unsolved.
That's part of the intrigue, right? History is full of these fascinating puzzles, and we might never have all the pieces, but that's what makes it so captivating. Now, how about we step out of those history books and into the present, ready to tackle some real-world cases?
Bring it on. What kind of mysteries are we solving today?
Let's say we're investigating the effectiveness of a new community policing program aimed at reducing crime. We want to see if this program can actually improve trust between law enforcement and the community they serve.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty relevant and timely case. How would you use a field experiment to investigate something like that?
Well, first, we'd need to choose a city or neighborhood to be our crime scene, so to speak. Then we'd carefully select two similar neighborhoods, one where we implement the new policing program and another that serves as our control group, business as usual.
So it's about making sure those neighborhoods are as alike as possible so you can really isolate the effects of that new policing program, like comparing apples to apples.
Exactly. We'd want to control for all those other variables that might influence crime rates, demographics, economic factors, even the existing crime rates in both neighborhoods.
So it's about making sure the only difference between those two neighborhoods is the policing program itself.
Right. Then we'd train the officers in those new community policing strategies and roll out the program in our target neighborhood.
And then you just sit back and watch the data roll in, right? See if crime goes down in the neighborhood with the new program.
Well, it's not quite that passive. We definitely track crime rates in both neighborhoods over a set period of time. But remember, this isn't just about crunching numbers. We also want to understand how the program impacts people's perceptions of the police, how it affects that relationship between law enforcement and the community.
So it's not just about the hard data arrests, crime stats. It's about people's experiences, their feelings of safety and trust.
Exactly. We'd probably use surveys, maybe focus groups, even interviews with residents in both neighborhoods to get a sense of how they feel about the police, whether they feel safer, whether they trust the police more.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a much more holistic approach than just focusing on crime statistics.
Right. It's about getting the full picture, understanding the impact of the program from multiple angles.
So unlike a controlled lab setting where you can isolate variables more easily, with a field experiment, you're dealing with the messy reality of human behavior, all those unpredictable factors that come into play in the real world.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so challenging and so rewarding. It's like you're solving a mystery in real time with all its twists and turns. You have to be adaptable, creative, and ready for anything.
I can see how that would be both exciting and demanding, like being a detective, a sociologist, a community organizer, all rolled into one.
You got it. Field experiments require a unique blend of skills and perspectives, and when done well, they can provide some really powerful insights into how to create positive change in the real world. But it's important to remember that even the best designed field experiment is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to understand. It sounds like field experiments are really good at exploring those shades of gray in life where there aren't always clear-cut answers.
You've hit the nail on the head. And speaking of exploring nuances, how about we shift gears one last time and dive into a research method that's all about getting up close and personal with the complexities of individual cases?
Ooh, sounds intriguing. Tell me more about this deep dive into the world of case studies. All right, I'm ready to trade in my detective hat for, maybe a comfy chair and a notebook. Bring on those case studies.
Perfect timing. I've got a really interesting case lined up for us. It takes us into the world of education.
Oh, education. Always a fascinating topic. What kind of case are we looking at?
Well, imagine a high school that's struggling with low graduation rates. They're trying to figure out why so many students aren't making it to that finish line.
Yeah, that's a big issue. Lots of factors could contribute to that, I imagine.
Exactly. And that's where case studies can be so valuable. Instead of just looking at the overall statistics, you zoom in, you focus on individual students who dropped out, you try to understand their stories, their challenges, what led them to make that decision.
So you're shifting the focus from the big picture to those individual experiences. It's like putting a face to the statistics.
You got it. Remember, case studies are all about those rich, detailed insights that you wouldn't get from a larger scale study. It's like reading a biography versus skimming a census report. You get a much deeper understanding of the individual and their context.
Right, you're getting the human side of the story, those nuances that might get lost in the data.
Exactly. Now, you might be wondering how you choose which cases to study. You don't just pick randomly, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. You'd want to be strategic about it.
You would. The goal is to choose cases that are particularly revealing or representative of the larger issue you're trying to understand. So in this case, you might select students who represent different demographics, different academic backgrounds, different personal circumstances, a diverse group that can shed light on different aspects of the problem.
So it's like putting together a diverse panel of witnesses, each with their own unique story to tell.
Perfect analogy. And just like a detective interviewing those witnesses, a researcher conducting a case study would use a variety of methods to gather information.
Like what kinds of tools do they use?
Interviews are a big one, of course. Talking to the students themselves, their families, maybe their teachers. But you might also look at school records, conduct observations, or even give surveys to students, teachers, and parents.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, drawing on different sources of information to get a complete picture.
Exactly. You want to be as thorough as possible, just like a good detective. And one of the really cool things about case studies is that they can help you generate hypotheses that can then be tested using other research methods.
Oh, so they can be a springboard for further research.
Exactly. Let's say our case study reveals that a lack of access to after-school programs is a common factor among students who dropped out. That could lead to a larger scale study to investigate that relationship, see if there's a statistically significant correlation.
So even though case studies might not give you that broad generalizability that you'd get from a survey or an experiment, they can still play a huge role in moving our understanding forward.
They absolutely can. They're like those little side quests in a video game that might lead you to hidden treasures and unexpected insights.
I love that analogy. It's those unexpected discoveries that often make research so exciting. But I have to ask, what about those common misconceptions about case studies? People saying they're just anecdotal or too subjective.
Yeah, case studies definitely get a bad rap sometimes. Some people think they're not real research, that they're just stories, not data. But that's just not true. Case studies, when they're done rigorously and systematically, can be just as valid as any other research method.
So it's about being aware of the limitations, but also recognizing the unique strengths of the case study approach.
Exactly. When they're done well, case studies can provide insights that you wouldn't get from any other method, that depth of understanding, that richness of detail. There's all about embracing those complexities and nuances.
I'm really starting to see how all these different research methods we've talked about fit together: surveys, ex post facto studies, field experiments, case studies. They're like different tools in a toolbox, each with its own purpose.
That's a great way to think about it. And the key takeaway for all of us, whether we're researchers or just curious individuals, is that research isn't some abstract thing that happens in a lab. It's all around us.
It's how we make sense of the world, right?
Exactly. Whether you're reading a news article, evaluating a new policy, or just trying to understand your own experiences, those principles of good research can help you navigate a world that's overflowing with information.
So it's about being curious, asking questions, and not just taking things at face value. It's about looking for the evidence, considering different perspectives, and being open to changing your mind.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Remember, you don't need a fancy degree or a lab coat to be a researcher. All you need is a curious mind and a willingness to dig a little deeper.
Well, I think we've successfully cracked the case of research methodologies. It's been a fascinating journey, and I feel like I've learned a ton.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the world is full of fascinating mysteries waiting to be explored. Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and never lose that detective spirit.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep creating valuable content like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community for more insights into psychology and personal development. Let's grow and learn together. See you in the next video.